A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrilla.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon tausend Schabbos hat es getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is part 7 in our ongoing series about the Kastner train and trial. And this episode will finally begin the trial. The second part of this series will be about the trial, which took place in a Jerusalem district court in the mid-1950s, and it's erroneously known as the Kastner trial. He was the star witness. He was the subject of much of the proceedings, but he was not on trial. He was never prosecuted, nor was he the defendant. He was a witness at this trial. We'll get to that. Hopefully this trial story will be 3, max 4 parts. Today will be an overview for, the general background, what instigated the trial. Next week, hopefully, will be the trial itself. And finally, the following week will be the aftermath and the legacy of the trial. And this last part would include the subsequent public reaction to the trial as it has been shaped over the decades by various writers on the topic, such as Ben Hecht in his book Perfidy, and many, many other writers, researchers, and others. I suspect that it might take an extra episode to cover all that, so it might end up being 4 instead of 3 installments. I want to open with a story that took place in 1943, and this was in February 1943 in Hungary, in the outskirts of Budapest, when Kastner, this is long before, March 1944 is when Hungary was occupied by the Nazis, so this is February 1943, long before the Nazi occupation, but also long before anyone imagined or anticipated a Nazi occupation. Hungarian Jewry was relatively safe. Polish Jewry was relatively exterminated and gone. The Holocaust was almost over in Poland at this point. By November 1943, there would be almost no Jews left to kill in Poland. So the Nazis already, by February 1943, had exterminated almost all Jews that they would kill in the Holocaust. They had already done so, but Hungarian Jewry was relatively safe. And the Aid and Rescue Committee, which was the Zionist rescue organization in Budapest, which was Kastner was one of its leaders. So they were engaged in rescue. At this point, there's not much rescue in Hungary itself because they're not under Nazi occupation, so they're rescuing others. They're helping refugees from Slovakia, from Poland, those in Hungary who do need papers, who need to escape, things like that. And that's the type of rescue they're involved with. So I want to quote directly from, I mentioned his book last week, Dr. Chaim Weitz. The book is called, the English translation is called The Man Who Was Murdered Twice. So I want to quote directly from that book. He tells a story of a meeting which took place in February 1943 of the Aid and Rescue Committee, and where Kastner spoke. And there's a direct quote from Kastner's speech. Now, it's important, again, I want to just emphasize the time. This is long before there's any Nazi occupation, so there's long before there's any negotiations about rescuing Hungarian Jewry. This is long before the blood for goods negotiations, the blood for the Jews for trucks negotiations, the Kastner train negotiations, long before that, well over a year before that, okay? So this is the quote from the book. From February 1943, the committee maintained contact with Poland through couriers, and its members knew that beyond the relatively safe border of Hungary, European Jewry was being systematically exterminated. Kastner knew very well how shaky and fragile was the relative security that Hungarian Jews were enjoying at this time. In the summer of 1943, at his request, about 80 members of the Zionist pioneer youth movements gathered in Kesselberg in the Buda Mountains, where he laid out before them his grim forecast. He warned those present that Hungarian Jewry too was expected and soon to meet a fate similar to that which had befallen all the Jews of Europe, and he called on them to organize rescue operations. Open parentheses. I'm just busting in to the quote for a second. The next paragraph is seemingly a direct quote from Kastner's speech on this occasion in the summer of 1943. I'm sorry, I think I said before February 1943. This meeting took place in the summer of 1943. So this is from Kastner's speech during that time, going back to the direct quote. "We are faced with a difficult problem. We will not be able to save all the Jews of Hungary and the refugees who arrive every day from Poland, Slovakia, and Yugoslavia. The problem is whether we are permitted to function as God, that is, to decide whom to save and whom not to save. Are we morally permitted to save only some of the Jews? How will history judge us?" That's the end of the quote from Kastner. I'm going back to quoting from Yechiam Weitz in his book. Following these words, an oppressive silence fell, and only after long minutes did one of those present rise and say, "I do not agree at all with the way the question has been posed. In my opinion, if we have the ability to save a Jew, we must not do so based on considerations of yes or no. That would be considered in my eyes as murder. I believe we must do everything to save whoever we can." After that, a vote was held, and this latter position was approved unanimously. So this is an amazing, I think, as far as I know, this meeting is not well known. I've never heard it discussed when the Kastner story is spoken about. First of all, I remind you, this was the Secular Zionist Aid and Rescue Committee. This is the meeting they're having in the summer of 1943 about how to rescue Jews. All right? All types of Jews. Jews of Hungary, Jews of Poland, Slovakia. It doesn't make a difference if they're Zionist or Orthodox or anything. How to rescue other Jews. Do we rescue the few? Do we try to rescue everybody? Do we try to play God? Is that morally wrong to decide who to save and who not to save? What is our approach to rescue now that it's seemingly become obvious that Hungary is the last Jewish community and looks like the Nazis are going to come to Hungary as well? How they knew that in the summer of 1943 is anybody's best guess. Maybe they just expected the worst. I don't know. As far as I know, the Nazis themselves did not know that they were going to occupy Hungary in March 1944. But they're preparing for a worst case scenario. Okay, so that all is a fascinating meeting, that they were completely cognizant of the fact that these are morally problematic choices, right? That these were challenging. That how are we going to make such choices? Are we even allowed to make such choices? These are something that they are aware of even before the Nazis occupied Hungary. And Kastner himself is the one delivering the speech. And it's not clear. And then they vote on it. They vote that we must do everything to save whoever we can, and that position was approved unanimously. And that seems to be the approach of the Aid and Rescue Committee. Again, the Secular Zionist Aid and Rescue Committee from that moment on. Now, all that to me is fascinating. I think it's not well known. But to me, the most fascinating sentence from that whole story, from that whole speech, is the last thing that Kastner said. How will history judge us? In other words, Kastner himself, in the summer of 1943, before negotiations begin, before the Nazi occupation of Hungary, before the whole Kastner train story, he is laying out a vision that one day history is going to come along and judge him. And he is not sure if he's making the correct moral decision. And let us see how history judges him. Okay? So he makes this prediction that history will judge him because he understands that this is controversial and there is no objective right or correct way to do this. But this is a harsh and tragic reality, and it is difficult to judge in hindsight to those who were experiencing it in real time. And what I find even more fascinating is another thing that I think is not so well known. Years later, many years later, jumping ahead to the very end of the story, Kastner's already assassinated. The verdict of the trial, which we're going to start speaking about today, was appealed to the Supreme Court in Israel, where most of the verdict was overturned, aside from the fact that he testified on behalf of the war criminal and murderer SS officer Kurt Becher. That the Supreme Court upheld. That was true. That was something that Kastner did. That was not only morally reprehensible, but was objectively wrong, right? So, but we're jumping ahead. Let's jump to Yerushalayim on January 17th, 1958. What happens on that day is the Supreme Court gives their verdict on the appeal. Justice Shimon Agranat, who later on became famous for the Agranat Commission after the Yom Kippur War. So Justice Shimon Agranat wrote the majority decision of the Supreme Court, which overturned Judge Binyamin Halevi's original verdict at the Yerushalayim District Court, where the original trial took place. And the Supreme Court overturns it in a 4-1 decision. Shimon Agranat's opinion ran 194 pages, and it includes a fascinating sentence. It says in there, history will be the judge on Kastner and his actions, not in a court of law. Meaning that the judge on Kastner will not be a judge in a court of law, but it will be history. History will judge him. So what did Agranat mean by that? And needless to say, Agranat was presumably not aware of the 1943 meeting I just described earlier. Agranat was saying something that in a court of law, it would be very difficult to judge in a technical and legal sense the legality of Kastner's actions under duress during that horrifying time of the Holocaust. What were Kastner's true motivations? Were his motivations to be a collaborator with the Nazis? Was his motivation to an attempt to save some Jewish lives? Was he a hero or a villain? Was it somewhere in between? Is it a complex reality during that time? So that Shimon Agranat is saying it's very difficult for a judge sitting in the 1950s in Israel in a court of law, looking through the legality, looking through the law book to judge or convict or acquit someone like that. It's very difficult. But Shimon Agranat was explicitly leaving a space here by saying that history will be the judge for moral judgment, not legal judgment, moral judgment. History, and presumably he also means society like us, can judge Kastner and his controversial actions. Because this is a moral, not a legal debate about Kastner and his faulty and morally problematic decisions that he made at that time. This is a fascinating full circle, because they're both using the same exact language. Kastner himself in Budapest in 1943, before the Nazi invasion, Kastner's predicting that these kind of moral questions which arise in rescue work in hard, difficult times will be judged by history. And it ends 15 years later in 1958, after the trials, after Kastner's not even alive, as he's assassinated. Agranat closing the story, because it kind of ends with the, at least that part, there's books and stuff written about it till today, so it never ends, but at least the trial part ends by Agronot saying that history will judge the story. So the beginning is predicting that history will judge the story, and the end of the story is saying that history will judge the story. So my conclusion, my modest conclusion, is that the verdict of history is still out on this. History is still judging this incredible narrative. We are all of us today, whoever engages with Jewish history and specifically the Kastner story, are engaging in history judging that time period and the actions of these individuals, Kastner and other members of the Hungarian Jewish leadership, the Budapest Jewish leadership. And this podcast series of Jewish History Soundbites is also contributing, making a small contribution by engaging with this narrative to help history judge him, Kastner, and the entire saga. So all of us are part of this process, and we're all sitting as judges, and that's exciting. So let's go on. Let's take a screenshot of the end of the war. The end of the war, Kastner is in Switzerland. He arrives there almost in the last days of the war. Hungarian Jewry is the tragedy is just sinking in now. 434,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. Many more thousands were killed in death marches and on the banks of the Danube in the last weeks of the war. And there were survivors of Hungary, mostly in Budapest itself, where the deportations at the end of the war never took place. So there's over 100,000 Jews in Budapest. There's survivors of Auschwitz who return home, and survivors who had been in hiding, and survivors of the labor brigades. And then so the Hungarian Jewry is confronting the tragedy, the horror that it had experienced. And then we have the Kastner train. 1,684 survivors of the Kastner train. They ended up in Switzerland too. So they're in Switzerland, and then they disperse. Some to Israel, some to the United States, some return to Hungary, some stay in Switzerland, and some go to other countries in the world. They completely disperse all over the place after the war. Others too. I mean, what happens to other people we've been talking about? Rescue activists such as Michael Weissmandl and other members of the working group. So Gissi Fleischman, the head of the working group, the rescue activist heroine, the Zionist leader who spearheaded the rescue efforts of the working group, she ends up getting killed in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Michael Weissmandl miraculously is able to escape a train to Auschwitz, make it back to Bratislava. He hides in a bunker and survives the war, moves to the United States, and he reestablishes the Nitri Yeshiva. He never got over the horror and the tragedy that he had experienced. He had done so much to attempt to rescue, and he never really overcame that not enough was done. Other members of the rescue committee in Bratislava, the working group, Oscar Newman, Andre Steiner, they survived and dispersed. Andre Steiner to the United States, Oscar Newman to Israel, and other members as well. What about the other leaders of Hungarian Jewry? So Samu Stern, he remained in Budapest, the famous Neolog leader, probably the most famous leader in Hungary, the head of the Budapest Jewish Council during the war, the Judenrat, and he defends his actions. He became a very controversial figure because of his morally questionable leadership and decisions that he made in not informing Hungarian Jewry about Auschwitz. So he tries to defend his actions after the war. He writes something of a memoir. He passed away shortly after the war. He was already an elderly man and ill during the war, and he passed away shortly afterwards. And his legacy remains controversial until today. Very similar with several other members of the Hungarian Jewish leadership. Neolog, secular, Orthodox, all kinds. In other words, the indictment, the accusations, the controversy surrounding the actions of Kastner wasn't unique to Kastner at all. It was around many members of the Hungarian leadership, the Budapest Jewish leadership, because all of them were privy to this information about Auschwitz. All of them had interactions with SS officers. All of them chose to not divulge this information, not to cause panic, not to share the information with the masses of Hungarian Jewry, and all of them became controversial during and after the war because of these decisions. Why is Kastner unique? Because he ended up in Israel. And no one cared about neolog after the war. Definitely no one really made an issue about assimilated and secular Jews after the war. But the state of Israel is a big deal after the war. So someone who's a hotshot in the government in the state of Israel and the Zionists, so then that becomes an issue, right? Also because Kastner actually did something. He rescued a trainload, right? So he's saying, hey, you did something, you could have done more. The other Hungarian Jewish leaders, the Orthodox, the neolog, the secular assimilated, they didn't do much at all. They didn't even rescue one trainload. So if they didn't do anything, so they're, I guess we can't really expect much from them, right? So the Hungarian Jewish leadership during the war remains in controversy. Of course, we mentioned that Freudiger escaped in August 1944 to Romania. He eventually makes it to Israel too. We'll get back to him soon. So let's focus on Kastner itself leading up to the trial. So we have how does the Jewish world start to view Kastner in the years leading up to the trial? So on one hand, there's the pros. Let's do the pros and cons. Let's measure the pros and cons. On one hand, there's 1,684 Jews that he saved, an entire trainload of Jews that he saved, that were alive now because of him and his negotiations with the SS. So that's a pro. The negotiations were successful. The other activities of the Aid and Rescue Committee, both before and after the train. So the Aid and Rescue Committee, including Kastner, they saved many Jews before that as well, right? Over the course of the war. And afterwards, too. They kept on negotiating with the Nazis and trying to rescue Jews from hiding in bunkers and in concentration camps. But if we go back to the train story itself, we delve a little deeper into the train story, the sheer numbers of those saved, 1,684, is virtually unmatched during the entire Holocaust, aside from diplomatic efforts. Diplomatic or people outside, not under Nazi occupation. If you're outside, not under Nazi occupation, you have more opportunities there's less risk involved, you have more opportunities to rescue Jews. Or people who have diplomatic cover, Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, these great diplomatic heroes. I'm not minimizing their efforts, obviously. But if we put aside diplomats and those not directly under Nazi occupation, then maybe I'm missing one or two, and if anyone can think of others, I'd love to hear about it, and it could be I'm mistaken here, so I'm leaving room for that. But I think this might be the largest rescue effort. Oskar Schindler saved 1,200 Jews. Heroic, very heroic. Tuvia Bielski and the Bielski brothers in the Nalibucky Forest and the Partisans also saved around 1,200 Jews. Also incredibly heroic. Many other instances. Every story is amazing. But here this is almost 1,700. It's an incredible, almost unmatched, pretty much unmatched. And also more fundamentally, this was seemingly, again, to the best of my knowledge, if anyone else can correct me, I will stand corrected, the only instance during the entire duration of the Holocaust that a real official formal crack was made in the final solution. What do I mean by that? Is that the SS agreed to not carry out the final solution on specific Jews. The SS never did that. They were bribed here to do it. Now, they had it. You'll tell me Oskar Schindler, right? Oskar Schindler is similar, very similar. The only difference is that even though it was with bribes and everything, so it was the bribes of Oskar Schindler did to the SS in Krakow that did it. That's obvious. But at least there was a cover story. The cover story was that they're working in his factory. Now, we know that it was because of the bribes, right? He gave the SS the bribes. But there was some sort of cover stories that they're working, so they're needed for slave labor. And the SS, that's the Selektia in Auschwitz. The Selektia in Auschwitz is that even though the SS wants to kill all the Jews, But they also need slave labor, so they do a selectia. They allow some Jews to live in concentration camps because they need some slave labor. So it's a bit diavad, we'll let them live, right? Even though lichatchila we'd rather send all the Jews to the gas chambers. So by Oskar Schindler, it's seemingly similar to that. They're officially being used for slave labor. Here, this is a real crack in the final solution. There are 1,684 Jews who the SS say these will be absolved from the final solution. That means that we created a crack in the murderous ideology, the murderous operation of the SS, of the Nazis, of the German people to wipe out the Jewish people. We're able to crack that sow a seed, and had this, had this been able to continue, perhaps then even more could have been saved. I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting point. That's the pros. What are the cons? Many cons about Kastner. First of all, you start with Kastner as a person. I mean, he was a very flawed personality. He was not easy to deal with. Megalomania, arrogance, control freak. People did not like him as a person. Many people did. But you see, even descriptions, there's all kinds of testimonies of people who were close with him, talking about secular Zionists who worked with him, who worked with him before the war, way before the Holocaust, way before when he was in Cluj, a young man in Cluj, people who worked with him in the Zionist organization, I'm talking about. Way before he became a controversial figure with negotiations and SS and all that. There were, and again, I'm not talking about religious, secular, Zionist, anti-Zionist, nothing with that. I'm talking about secular Zionists who worked with him. They pointed out personality flaws and difficulties working with him. He was a difficult person, and he thrived on power and connections and askanas. I live in the Haredi community in Israel. I see what it does to people when they're in leadership positions and askanas and activism. So he had that. He was a flawed personality. I was speaking to a good friend of mine this week. I met him here, and he's a friend of mine. He's a Satmar Chassid from Williamsburg, dedicated listener of the podcast, and incredibly knowledgeable. He's taught me so much about this particular subject on the Kastner story, and in general, he's just a wellspring of history. He doesn't want me to mention his name. He's so modest. But we were schmoozing, and he was visiting Israel, and we were discussing, if we could compare just as people, as human beings, as Jews, as personalities, two different rescue activists, Kastner and Reb Michael Ber Weissmandel. And we're saying Reb Michael Ber Weissmandel is such an easy hero because no one ever had an issue with him. Maybe Rudolf Verba was the only person I ever heard who was critical of Reb Michael Ber Weissmandel. You can't criticize the guy, again, besides for Verba. He did everything he could to save any kind of Jew. He never let anything stop him. He was just, a beloved person. No one could criticize his personality, his atzilus, his noble character traits. He was a good person. He was a good human being. He was a good Jew. He was a good everything. And he tried so hard, and he was this real hero. And as opposed to, meaning it's not a complex story with Michael Ber Weissmandel. It's easy to like him. Whereas Kastner's a very flawed character, a very problematic personality, very complex, did good things, did questionable things, had a questionable character, had good things about him, and it's much more complicated. We don't like complicated things. It's much harder to deal with, right? So that's just, one side of it. We also know that Kastner was certainly guilty, this is 100%, I mean, no one disagrees with this, of testifying on behalf of SS officer Kurt Becher after the war. And people were repulsed by this. Many were also just disgusted with his attitude, his character, things that he said or did. After the war, people met him in Switzerland, and he actually said this. He said he misses the excitement of the position that he had during the war, dealing with the SS, making these decisions, being on top of the whole rescue efforts, and now he's a nobody. Now he's nothing in Switzerland. He actually said that. There's testimonies that he said that. That's hard to hear. People, and I'm talking about, again, secular Zionists who met with him after the war, they were disgusted by this type of attitude. So he's already facing heavy criticism for his activities during the war at that time. Aside from the criticism of his testifying on behalf of Kurt Becher, there's also the more serious accusation and controversial decision about him not warning the general populace of Hungarian Jewry regarding the upcoming deportations, and perhaps even actively deceiving them. That is unclear if he actually did that. But for sure, he did not warn them. And this latter controversial behavior forms the basis of the entire Kastner controversy and subsequent trial. There was other stuff. There was also the claim that he did not help the paratroopers. There was the whole story of paratroopers of the Yishuv who paratrooped into different countries of Europe to try to organize resistance against the Nazis in Slovakia and Yugoslavia and Hungary. And the ones who landed in Hungary were either not assisted by Kastner or perhaps even betrayed by Kastner. It came up at the trial. This is the famous Chana Senesh, Peretz Goldstein, a couple of others, Yoel Palagi, I forgot the third guy's name. That was an accusation brought up at the trial. Chana Senesh's mother testified at the Kastner trial. There was also Kastner's relationship with Joel Brand and the Brand mission. There was Kastner's relationship with Brand's wife. There was also Kastner's relationship with Moshe Kraus, the other Zionist leader in Budapest during the war, and how they didn't get along with each other and perhaps even backstabbed each other. There's a lot of things to not like about Kastner and controversies about his activities during the war. So this is what starts to emerge and eventually leads to the trial. So there's actually another set of criticisms which begin to emerge after the war, and they revolve around two principal points. One, this idea starts to evolve that Kastner didn't just make bad decisions during a challenging time, he was actually a collaborator with the Nazis. Whoa. That was a big jump. That didn't take place during the war. That starts to be whispered and then spoken about after the war, leading to the accusation made, which comes to the trial. Okay, number two, and this is much more audacious. This was invented after the war, and this was fabricated. This becomes a major story during the trial and till today, in religious circles and other circles. This becomes the story almost, that really Kastner was just a little guy. He was really just a pawn. He was really just an agent for something much larger. Who's looming in the background? Who's the real story? Who's the conspiracy behind Kastner? The leaders of the World Zionist Organization, especially the secular leadership of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, who coincidentally were now the leaders of the Mapai-controlled, Mapai-dominated nascent state of Israel in the 1950s. They are the government of the state of Israel in the 1950s. And they were the one who were pulling the strings. Kastner was a puppet, and they were the one making the decisions. They were the ones calling the shots. They were the ones who really were negotiating with the Nazis, and they are the ones who are guilty of all of Kastner's crimes. Kastner was just a straw man. That's what starts to emerge in the early 1950s. This becomes the dominant theme of the trial, and this becomes a major portion in the collective memory of today, largely because of Hecht and other people. And this is probably one of the only parts of the story that we can certainly say pretty decisively that it's completely made up. It's completely not true. If you have issues, and if there's a guilty person, it was Kastner. There's no real, big conspiracy behind him. And it's also preposterous to even think it. I mean, during those few weeks in June under Nazi occupation, dealing with the SS, he was on a WhatsApp chat with how would it even happen, right? But We'll get to that soon. Now, why did these two critiques, which are much more serious than the others, that Kastner's actually a collaborator, and that Kastner's just a fall guy. It was really the Zionist leadership who did all this. Why did it emerge after the war? Are these two accusations true? And how did they instigate the trial that came to carry Kastner's name? So I want to make a spoiler. If we summarize the accusations against Kastner, and all of them, from beginning to end, and simplify them by breaking them down into 5 categories. Number 1, criticism of Kastner as a person. Number 2, his testimony on behalf of Kurt Becher after the war. Number 3, he subverted the brand mission and betrayed the paratroopers. Number 4, he didn't warn Hungarian Jewry regarding the impending deportation and perhaps even actively calmed them down. Number 5, he did all this under the auspices and direct orders of the leaders of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, who are the current leaders of the Mapai political party and the leaders of the State of Israel, and therefore all the accusations against Kastner are really against them as well. So before we delve into the trial, I want to say a word about these allegations. Number 1, which is about criticism of Kastner as a person, it's true, but it's irrelevant to the story, right? I mean, who cares if he was a bad person? The point is what happened during the war in the Holocaust, right? Number 2, his testimony on behalf of Kurt Becher, everyone agrees is true. No one has a good justification for it, to the best of my knowledge. So that's for sure bad, right? Bad to testify for a murderer Nazi. Number 3, about subverting the brand mission and betraying the paratroopers. That's debatable regarding the paratroopers and seemingly untrue regarding brand. We'll get to that when we discuss the trial. So we're left with 4 and 5. Number 4, that he didn't warn Hungarian Jews regarding the impending deportation and perhaps even actively calm them down. Everyone agrees that that's controversial. Everyone debates about it until today, what he did or didn't do and what he should have done. This issue was the main issue of the trial, and this issue will eternally remain the primary point of controversy and will likely never be fully resolved. So what are we left with? We're left with number 5. Number 5 is that really in the background, it's really the leaders of Mapai, the leaders of the State of Israel, the former leaders of the Jewish Agency, they're the ones pulling the strings. So this is obviously the wildest accusation because then it's no longer about Kastner. It's about the Israeli establishment of the 1950s. And that's what made it so popular and attractive and enticing. Anyone who is against the Israeli establishment of the 1950s, the revisionist Zionist movement, meaning the Jabotinsky Zionists, the right-wing Zionists, what later becomes the Likud, right? They were against the Mapai establishment of the 1950s. The Orthodox community were against the Mapai secular Zionist establishment, Israeli establishment of the 1950s. People who were anti-Zionist, Jewish, non-Jewish in Israel and around the world, were against the Mapai establishment, the Israeli leadership of the 1950s. And then you have people who are just anti-establishment, like Uri Avneri, the Olam Hazeh newspaper. He picked up this story and ran with it, even though he was a leftist, because Uri Avneri in the Olam Hazeh newspaper was a anti-establishment figure. He's like one of these contrarian people, and 1960s style America, right? Anti-establishment. All those types of people also don't like the Mapai Israeli establishment either. All of those groups got very excited, and to a certain extent continue to be excited about the Kastner story until this very day, because people wanted to believe this so desperately, because then the enemy isn't some relatively unknown and minor personality, Rudolf or Yisrael Kastner, but it is, it's a good enemy. It's a nice visible enemy. It's the entire established leadership of the then Zionist movement and of the State of Israel in the 1950s. That's a story. Where did this accusation come from? What's all the more confounding is that it isn't even true. There's no evidence to support the contention that Kastner, when negotiating with the SS in June 1944, was acting on orders from the Jewish Agency leadership in the Yishuv in Palestine. All of the evidence indicates otherwise. So where does it come from? So it's sort of implied in the initial pamphlet where Malkiel Grunwald accuses Kastner of his crimes, which he published, which instigated the libel trial. But it isn't explicit there. And although Grunwald hated the Mapai establishment, it is not clear if Grunwald himself believed in this conspiracy. Where was it really fully developed was over the course of the trial itself by Grunwald's lawyer, Grunwald or Grunwald, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Maybe it's Grunwald. Grunwald's lawyer was Shmuel Tamir. And Shmuel Tamir is someone we're going to get back to when we talk about the trial. The reason the trial was because of Shmuel Tamir. He was an incredible figure, brilliant, talented, and he ran the trial. It was his trial. He ran the trial. It wouldn't be a stretch to claim that Shmuel Tamir's entire objective for taking this job, supposedly, I don't know if it's ever been proven, but supposedly he took it pro bono. This was his mission. He wanted to defend Grunwald. His whole purpose was to expose his hated nemesis, the Mapai establishment. Tamir was a staunch revisionist, Jabotinsky Zionist, and the Mapai leftist labor Zionist establishment, who were the leaders of the state of Israel in his day, were his bitter enemies. Tamir probably didn't even know who Kastner was, and even if he did, he probably didn't care. And he was also likely that he didn't know much or care much about the Holocaust either. There's one thing that Tamir knew, that Kastner, or that he wanted to believe, and he wanted to think was true, that Kastner was a pawn in this story, and the Kastner saga was just an opportunity to get back at his real enemy, the Mapai establishment. In other words, the story of the trial is not a story about Hungarian Jewry. It's not a story about Kastner. It's not a story about the SS and negotiations, and it's not even a story about the Holocaust. The story was the internal politics of the state of Israel in the 1950s. The other stuff were all just a convenient backdrop. Because Tamir was such a brilliant lawyer, and he was very talented, he eventually came basically to control the court proceedings, and it almost became his personal show. And somehow the Judge Justice Binyamin Halevi, went along with it. We'll talk about that more as we delve into the trial. The point is that as a result of the Tamir general approach, the public perception was shaped in real time at the trial, and to a certain extent until this very day. And this was especially true since Ben Hecht published Perfidy, because the principal villain in Perfidy is not Kastner. The principal villain in Perfidy is the Mapai leadership establishment, who are the true guilty ones in the background, with Kastner merely being a pawn to do their bidding. The problem with this whole narrative is that it seems that it's not true. To the best of my knowledge, there's plenty to dislike about the Mapai establishment, by the way. I can do a whole series about how awful and how much there is to dislike about the Mapai establishment and the leadership of the state of Israel. In fact, if you want, I can just do a podcast about how awful the Israeli government has been since their inception until today, whether they've been on the right or left. That's totally fine. If we just want to be critical of the Israeli government, we can do that. I know I have plenty of material. But that's not the discussion. Are the Mapai good people or not? That's not the question. Okay? We can get back to that another time. But I don't think, as far as I know, as far as my research was able to find, there's not any actual evidence that the secular Zionist leadership of the Yishuv had anything to do with Kastner's negotiations with the SS in the summer of 1944, or with the Kastner train altogether, or even with his controversial actions regarding his lack of warning to Hungarian Jewry about Auschwitz, or with his testimony on behalf of Kurt Becher after the war. These were all Kastner's actions. Maybe in a broader sense, the actions of the Aid and Rescue Committee of Budapest, or maybe even in a broader sense, the general Jewish leadership of the Jewish Council of Budapest, such as the Neolog leader Samu Stern, or the Orthodox leader Pinchas Freudiger, or the secular leadership in Budapest during the war, but not the leaders in the Yishuv. The leaders in the Yishuv of Palestine had no connection to the story. But it has remained very popular in the religious community, in the revisionist Zionist community, in anti-establishment circles. Tamir and Hecht and a few others were decided enemies of the Mapai. This was a perfect story, and they had a profound influence in how the narrative was shaped. So my contention is that the trial had little to do with Kastner, or the SS, or the final solution, or the extermination of Hungarian Jewry. It had to do with the Jewish people, and specifically the Jewish society in the state of Israel, who were still grappling with the horrors of the Holocaust and the struggles of rebuilding during the 1950s. If we go back to Jewish society in the 1950s, we're looking at a nation traumatized, a people trying to make sense of what had just happened, a society confronting an event that seemed incomprehensible on one hand. It was not very well known about. People simply did not know about it because there was no books and movies yet. Survivors weren't really speaking about it yet. Everyone was struggling to rebuild. People really didn't know and understand what had happened. And yet, at the same time, it permeated every aspect of their individual and collective lives. In other words, the Holocaust is there and hovering in the background, but it's hard to confront. What is it? What exactly happened? And that is society. That is Jewish society in everywhere, in the United States, in England, anywhere else, but especially in the state of Israel, where Holocaust survivors were a dominant component of the population, almost a third of the population at one point in the 1950s, right? So the mindset of the 1950s is the Holocaust is everywhere, but at the same time, almost completely unknown and not understood. Now, today we live in a world where we know a ton about the Holocaust. It's hard for us to believe that in the 1950s, people didn't know much. But we live in it today where Holocaust survivors have opened up, and there's over 100,000 video testimonies out there of Holocaust survivors telling their story, where there's thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of books, memoirs, research, articles, memorials, museums, movies, documentaries, all about the Holocaust, and Holocaust education in schools, and all that, and remembrance days and stuff like that. Kinnis written for Tisha B'Av, all things. And in the 1950s, none of that had happened, or very little. I don't want to say none. Very little of that had happened yet. Now, a case in point, which will serve as a backdrop to all of this, is the very interesting law passed by the Israeli Knesset in August 1950. One of the earliest laws passed from the establishment of the State of Israel, called in Hebrew, Chok La'asiyat Din Banatzim Ube'ozrehem. The law to do justice with the Nazis and their collaborators, passed by the Israeli Knesset in August 1950. Who did they make this law for? Were there lots of Nazis running around Israel, SS running around Israel in August 1950? Nope. Were there local collaborators? In other words, Ukrainians, Hungarians, French, Dutch, Lithuanians, Poles, German civilians, all kinds of things like that. Were they running around Israel in 1950? Also none. Did the Mossad plan on capturing SS officers like Adolf Eichmann in August 1950? Absolutely not. They were trying to survive. They didn't even think about Nazis. So who is this law for? Why did they pass this law in August 1950? Who is it meant for? Who was actually prosecuted under this law? So we did an episode several years ago, which I think you should go back and listen to if you haven't heard it, about the Capo trials. This law was made for Jewish collaborators, capos in camps, Jewish police in the ghettos, Judenrat leaders in the ghettos. So these were the famous or infamous Capo trials. And there was over 50 of them over the course of the 1950s. And this law, Chok La'asiyat Din Banatzim Ube'ozrehem, is the only law until this very day, as of this recording. There's people who want to change it to include terrorists as well. But as of this recording, the only law in the state of Israel that carries the death penalty. So that means when they made this law to try Jewish collaborators with the Nazis, to try capos in the camps, and they would be sentenced to death. None of them were actually killed. One of them was actually sentenced to death, and then it was commuted. But he got a pardon. But the Jewish capos were put on trial. They were convicted. Some of them sat in jail. One of them was even sentenced to death. Just wasn't carried out. And this was a reality of the 1950s. Although this may sound more psychological than historical and hence out of my league, my historical understanding of Jewish and especially Israeli society during this time is very relevant to this discussion. First of all, why in Israel more than other places? Well, all Jews went through this trauma. Well, it was definitely in other places as well, but it was just more pronounced in Israel because it's all Jews, mostly, not all, but mostly Jews. It's the Jewish state. Holocaust survivors are about a third of the population. The survivors and the Jewish people at large sustained this great national trauma and great national tragedy. Not only was it not understood, it was simply hovering without it really being spoken about, without it really being known about. Let's take a step back. The Jewish people were now located physically, for the most part, in the United States, in Israel, in other non-formerly Nazi-occupied countries, in England, in South America, in Australia, wherever. They were far, far away, for the most part. There were still Jews on the European continent, in formerly Nazi-occupied countries, but for the most part, the Jewish people had dispersed. They were very far away from where the horrific events had taken place, physically, geographically. They were also far from the visuals, the physical remains of their loved ones, the ashes, the mass graves, the crematoriums, the bone fragments, the camps. They were far away from the countries they had lived in, the towns, the cities, the shtetls, the homes, the shuls, the communities they had lived in for hundreds of years or more. They were living in new countries, acclimating to new cultures, speaking new languages. And in the case of Israel, it was a new country altogether with its own set of challenges. Security, a lousy economy, socially, religiously, immigration, culturally. Everything was new. And most of all, who is missing? Who is missing from this picture in the 1950s? The Jewish people. Who is missing from among the Jewish people from the trauma of the Holocaust in the 1950s? More, beside for the victims, which we just said, the perpetrators! The perpetrators were missing! The Nazis! They weren't around. They weren't hanging around Israel or New York or other places where Jews lived in the 1950s. You didn't see SS around. You didn't see Nazis around. I want to elaborate on this overlooked point because I think it's rarely spoken about. The Nazis, the SS, the Nazi regime all disappeared. They're not physically present in Israel, of course, but they're also not physically present in Europe. The Jews did not put Nazis on trial at Nuremberg. The Allies did. And in any case, between me and you, Nuremberg didn't provide any justice. So the entire idea of the Nazis as perpetrators is all very abstract. It's almost esoterical. It's not physical. It's this concept called Nazis, but we don't know what they are. We've never seen one. What's this Nazi thing? They killed the Jews? Who are they? Where are they? Who is real? Who is in close proximity? Who's in front of everyone's face? Jews who supposedly enabled or collaborated with the Nazis. That is visible. That's real. That I see in Tel Aviv. That I see in Yerushalayim. That I see in New York City. That I see in front of my eyes. Those I could see. Then I could concretize the evil. I can't with the Nazis. There's nothing concrete. I'm physically far away. I'm far away from the victims. I don't have a grave. I don't have anything. There's no closure. There's no Nazis. There's no victims. There's no tangible. There's nothing. But the only thing I do see is a capo. So the Jewish collaborators are the only thing that exists that's tangible in the 1950s. Now this completely changed with the Eichmann trial in 1961. The Eichmann trial introduced the perpetrator to the Jewish people and to Israeli society. They introduced the Nazis. This is Eichmann. He represents the SS, the Nazis, the German people, the Nazi regime. These are the people who carried out the final solution, the extermination of Jewry during the Holocaust. And 100 witnesses get up, and the evidence piles up, and Eichmann becomes a symbol. And I spoke about this in my series on the Eichmann trial a couple of years ago, so you can check that out as well. And the Eichmann trial, because it introduces the perpetrator, because it introduces the SS, the Nazis, the Nazi regime, the Germans into the equation, into the story, that revolutionizes the perspective of Israeli society, the Jewish people in general, of the Holocaust. Wow, there were Nazis, there was SS, there was a Nazi regime, the German occupation. Before the Eichmann trial, there was nearly 50 capo trials in the 1950s. After the Eichmann trial, basically zero. It ended because now we found the real enemy. The Kastner trial takes place in the 1950s, in 1953 to be exact. 1954, a little bit 1955, 1954. 1950. Well, we'll get to the dates in a second. The Kastner trial could only have taken place in the 1950s, in the pre-Eichmann trial atmosphere. Why? Because in the 1950s, we're searching for the enemy among our own. The Jewish people is searching out and weeding out the enemy among our own because there is no other enemy known to us. The Germans are gone. We don't see them. They're not in front of us. And I'll bring you a great case in point. If we contrast the two testimonies of our old friend Freudiger. Pinchas Freudiger, he drops Philip and he drops his von title when he comes to Israel. Now he's Pinchas, Reb Pinchas Freudiger, one of the leaders of Agudas Yisrael, the prominent leader of Orthodox Jewry in Hungary, the wealthy leader of Orthodox Jewry in Hungary in Budapest before the war, and member of the Budapest Jewish Council, the Judenrat, during the Nazi occupation. He testifies at both trials. He testifies at the Eichmann trial, and earlier, a few years earlier, 1954, he testifies at the Kastner trial, right? Now, the Kastner trial's testimony and his testimony at the Eichmann trial were two very different. Why? Because they're for two different purposes. The Kastner trial, which was a libel case regarding Rudolf Kastner's wartime conduct and whether he collaborated with the Nazis or not, is one type of testimony, and his testimony in the Eichmann trial, which is the criminal prosecution of Adolf Eichmann for crimes against humanity and extermination of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, is two different subjects. So we'd expect them to be different. There's not that many people who testified at both, so I'm just using him as an example. Brand, the truth is both Brands, Joel and Hansi Brand, also testified at both, but we'll take Freudiger as an example. Freudiger testified at the Kastner trial about Jewish leadership decisions and Jewish leadership negotiations during the Holocaust, during the Nazi occupation of Hungary. At the Eichmann trial, he was a witness about Nazi actions, Nazi crimes, and describing his direct encounters and meetings with Adolf Eichmann. In the Kastner trial, his focus was on the politics of Jewish negotiation strategy among the Jewish leadership in Budapest. In the Eichmann trial, his focus of his testimony was on accountability for the mass murder of the Jews done by the Nazis and putting on the historical record what the Nazis did to the Jewish people, right? And he's testifying from his own personal experience. Because he was a member of the Jewish leadership, so he interacted with Kastner, and he was a member of the Jewish leadership, so he interacted with Eichmann and witnessed. Now, I'll tell you something in common about both trials. At both trials, the spectators in the courtroom, started reacting, shouting and yelling at Freudiger because he was a member of the Jewish leadership in Budapest and he did nothing to warn them about the impending deportations to Auschwitz. So the spontaneous reaction of the audience was the same to Freudiger's testimony. By the way, his testimony in the Kastner trial is pretty interesting because he testified about internal Jewish leadership debates, and Freudiger, the Orthodox leader, criticized all negotiations with the Nazis. He criticized the rescue plans such as the Trucks for Blood. He criticized Rechober Weissmandel's Europa plan. He criticized Kastner's negotiations. He says, we shouldn't have done any negotiations, and we couldn't have and we shouldn't have alerted the masses about the deportations. We should have let them, and what we did was the right thing. We just let them go to their deportation silently without warning them. He defended his actions, and that's what instigated the audience to start yelling at him. Now, at the Eichmann trial, he's describing Eichmann's role in the deportations. What did Eichmann do? What did the Nazis do? What did the SS do? They deported Hungarian Jewry. They killed them all. So, in this contrast, we see the two natures of the trials. The Eichmann trial is introducing the perpetrator. The Kastner trial is talking about Jewish leadership and what they did wrong and what they did right. Another related but different backdrop to the trial. I started to mention it earlier. Shmuel Tamir is using the trial for Israeli political ends. The revisionist Zionists, the right-wing Zionists, the Jabotinsky Zionists, they don't like the labor Zionists, the Mapai Zionists, the left-wing Zionists during the British Mandate already. And that continues when it's the Mapai establishment of the State of Israel, the government in the 1950s. And this is how we understand how Kastner is to be a pawn. We're just using him to get back at the establishment Mapai in the context of contemporary Israeli politics of the 1950s. This, like I said, it's not really related to Kastner and Hungarian Jewry during the Holocaust. It's more about Israeli society during the 1950s, grappling with the Holocaust through the prism of their own societal challenges during this time. And it is within this environment that we introduce Malkiel Grunwald. Malkiel Grunwald and how the trial was instigated from the end of the war until sometime in 1947. Kastner resided in Switzerland. He then moves to Palestine. He worked as a journalist. He also worked for the government. And in August 1952, a Hungarian Jewish journalist in Yerushalayim named Malkiel Grunwald self-printed a mimeograph pamphlet entitled Letters to My Friends in Mizrahi, which is the religious Zionist political party, to which Malkiel Grunwald was affiliated. He self-distributes it. No money made on the venture. He is not trying to be sensational to make money. He doesn't make any money off this. And in it, he makes the accusation against Kastner for the first time. Among other things, he wrote this. This is obviously a translation to English from the original Hebrew, which he didn't write in Hebrew. He didn't know Hebrew. He wrote it in German, and he had, I think, his daughter or someone translated it into Hebrew, and now I'm translating it into English. I got an English translation. I have waited a long time to expose this careerist, whom I consider, because of his collaboration with the Nazis, an indirect murderer of my people. Who is this spokesman of the Ministry of Trade and Industry? Who is this big shot leader of the Hungarian Jews? Who is this fellow who has been put high on the list of candidates for Israel's parliament by the government party Mapai? This character is Dr. Rudolf Kastner, political adventurer driven by sickly megalomania. For whom, on whose account, Dr. Kastner, did you go like a thief in the night to Nuremberg to become a witness for the defense of SS Colonel Kurt Becher, the murderer of Jews, the man who wallowed in the blood of our brothers in Hungary? Kurt Becher, economic administrator of the Gestapo. Why did you save him from the death penalty, which he had so richly earned? You flew to Nuremberg to save a mass murderer of the Jews. Who induced you to do that? What kind of gentleman's agreement was there between this murderer Becher and this man who I accuse as a collaborator with the Nazis? And it is the same Kastner that Mapai has taken to its bosom and placed high on its list of officials. My God! Kastner's deeds in Budapest cost us the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews. We demand an impartial public committee of investigation. Kastner must be removed from the politics and from the society of this land. We shall keep this on our agenda until the evil is ended. He wanted to save himself so that Becher would not reveal to the international court their deals and their joint acts of robbery. Where now is the money of the Jews of Hungary? Millions for which no accounting is given. He saved no fewer than 52 of his relatives and hundreds of other Jews, most of whom had converted to Christianity, bought their rescue from Kastner by paying millions. That's how Kastner saved the members of Mapai. He saved people with connections, made a fortune in the process. but thousands of senior Zionists, members of the Mizrahi, and the ultra-religious parties, these Kastner left in the valley of the shadow of death. That is a quote. That's not the entire article. There's quite a bit more. I just took an excerpt from the article. Now, there's a bunch of, outright untruths. First of all, who Kastner saved on the train. He wrote that most of those who he saved on the train were converts to Christianity. I think the Satmar Rav would be insulted by calling him a convert to Christianity. And he says that most of those who he saved were members of Mapai. That also is just not true. It's not close to any relation to reality. He also says that Kastner profited off of it, that he made millions, that he split the spoils with Kurt Becher. That's also not true. In fact, that's the only thing Halevi said it was libel in the verdict, that it was libel. So that was also not true. So, but he's making some serious accusations. Now, during the trial, Judge Binyamin Halevi divided the libel claim into 4 components. Number 1, Kastner collaborated with the Nazis. Number 2, Kastner was an indirect murderer, or at least enabled the murder of Hungarian Jewry. Number 3, he received lots of money for this, which was stolen or coerced from Hungarian Jewish victims. Number 4, he testified on behalf of a Nazi war criminal after the war. So if we skip ahead to the end of the trial, Judge Halevi would lay down in his verdict at the end of the trial that 3 out of these 4 were not libel, and the state had not successfully proven that it was libelous what Grunwald had written. Halevi did say that Kastner receiving money was libel because it seemed to be fabricated. There was no evidence that Kastner received any money for his personal benefit. I want to stop here for a minute. If we break down the 4 accusations, 2 are more abstract and 2 are more concrete. It would be very difficult to judge from a vantage point of a decade later in a Yerushalayim courtroom whether an action was either a heroic act of rescue, a controversial, immoral decision taken in haste during a tense and tragic time, or outright collaboration and enabling the murder of Hungarian Jewry. So Halevi's verdict on these 2 counts seem a bit limited or even flawed by their very essence. It's hard to judge that. It could be true, by the way. It could be that he was a collaborator. It could be that he enabled the murder. I don't know. It's just hard for Halevi to judge that, right? Halevi does acknowledge that the money thing wasn't true, and pretty much everyone acknowledges then and now that the only thing, and it's also the only thing that was upheld by the Supreme Court on appeal, that it was definitely a crime for Kastner to testify on behalf of Kurt Becher. So it's interesting to note all that. So it took a while, it took a few months, I think, but eventually these very serious accusations against Kastner written in Grunwald's pamphlet made it into some of the mainstream media outlets, and the government, who was Kastner's employer, grew concerned at this point. There was a dispute within the government leadership whether to ignore it or not, and the position of Chaim Cohen, who's going to become a very big character in our story, who at the time was the Justice Minister and Attorney General, and later the prosecutor at the trial, his position prevailed. He said that the accusations were serious, and they were serious enough that if they were true, then Kastner had no business working in a high government position and he needs to be fired. And if they were not true, then it must be shown that he's innocent of these charges. It must be displayed that he's innocent. So he felt that the best way to do that, since they were working under the assumption that the accusations were not true, and if anything, Kastner had negotiated with the SS in order to save a trainload of Jews during the Holocaust, so his decision was to sue Grunwald for libel. Then the onus would be on Grunwald to prove that it wasn't libel. He would have to prove that what he wrote in his pamphlet was true, because in fact Kastner was guilty of everything he claimed. So that's what the government did. They sued Grunwald for libel. Since Kastner was an employee of the state sued on his behalf. Technically, the name of the trial was the Attorney General of the Government of Israel versus Malkiel Grunwald, and it opened in the Jerusalem District Court on January 1st, New Year's, 1954. It remained in session until October 1954, and Judge Binyamin Halevi delivered his verdict on June 22nd, 1955. This trial came to be known to posterity by its main witness as the Kastner trial, because he served as the star witness, even though he never stood trial. He was just the witness stand, but he was essentially the subject of the trial. So, this is the end of the first part, is part 7 of the series, first part about the trial. We're going to continue with the actual trial itself next week. We're going to introduce the main characters of the trial. This was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.